Nomiki show. clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, faith fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki show. The Nomiki show. The Nomiki show. The Nomiki show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, faith fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki show.
Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science, I emphasize science, at Boston University. And he's the author of How to Talk to a Science Denier. Lee, thank you so much for joining. This is, I feel like, a topic we should just be discussing every single day, hoping that maybe it just hits one more person or two more people or three more people, because that's how significant this crisis of science denial is at this moment, whether it's pandemic or climate change or, other things that could be coming. So thanks for joining us, Lee. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
So, okay. Our audience knows I've been in Greece, and just a little update for the audience. There are now over 540 fires since we first started talking about the fires, which is a little over 2 weeks ago, where there were over 100 fires in Greece. And the political situation here, which I think relates to many parts of the globe, is you have a center-right government that was dependent on a far-right science-denying faction to go into their coalition to be able to win against what was, in at least Greece, the left government. And this government in particular, the center-right government of Mitsotakis, ran against the last government in how they handled one wildfire. So it's fascinating, because this is obviously our problem in the States, is that we have loose coalitions of many different political factions, but one that happens to be holding us all hostage right now, whether it's denying vaccine science or COVID science or mask science or just science. And of course, climate change. I mean, these fires are not unique to Greece. It's happening in Northern California. And, we know this is, we're on the science side here. Is this about convincing people anymore? I mean, I feel like these are the folks you just can't convince, and they're just keeping us hostage. Does it matter anymore?
I think it always matters to talk to people. And one important thing to realize is that science denial exists on a spectrum. And that, by the way, when you're talking to a science denier, don't use the word denier. I mean, I used it for the title of my book, but no one considers themselves a science denier. Some of them actually can consider themselves skeptics, or, more scientific than the scientists. But it does help to speak to them, because you shouldn't assume going in that they're hardcore and that they can't be converted. And you know what? Even if they were, there are some anecdotal accounts of hardcore climate deniers being converted. And here's the really fascinating thing. When that happens, it always happens in the exact same way, which is that they talk to somebody that they trust. The science denial is not just a crisis of facts, it's a crisis of trust. And so what do the facts matter? What magic words can you say to somebody to convince them if they don't trust you? How do you build trust? Face-to-face conversation, calm, respect, patience, listening. Very hard to pull off, but it can work. It doesn't work in every case, but it can work.
This reminds me of just old school political organizing. When you're doing door to door, you figure out, okay, maybe there's somebody who I can move because they're part of my community, they're part of my church. And this is actually what the right wing has been very effective at doing, is organizing with, within churches. But it could be your neighbor. It could be this was well known to work with the LGBTQ movement when they were fighting for marriage equality, was, friends and family. You'd find out that someone like a Dick Cheney could be moved because his daughter came out. Why hasn't this tactic has it been utilized with climate, for instance, to its effect? And simultaneously, I say this, it's one thing to reach out to them that way, but the radicalization that's happening online just seems to be happening at a much faster pace. Can you have these two things at the same time?
It is a challenge, right? Because the friends of science have to scale up because we're trying to catch a moving train here. But the good news is that it is possible. And in fact, you put your finger right on it. The best possible means of convincing somebody is somebody who already trusts you. Somebody where it's very hard with a stranger to try to build trust. But if somebody already trusts you, then you've got a little bit of an open door. And then the thing is, don't exploit the closeness that you have with the person to insult them. To make, to defy that trust. I was just hearing a story the other day about a young woman who was talking to her father about climate change. And he, was just intransigent, just, whatever facts she presented. And then she finally said, "Dad, why do you trust all these people that you've never met, but you don't trust your own daughter?" And that did the trick. So, that was an emotional appeal. It was not a factual appeal. But notice what happened. She went with the trust issue first, and then all of a sudden, all of the factual issues fell into place. If we think that the best way to confront a science denier is just to cram facts down their throat because they don't know them, that's wrong, and it will not work. And in the polarized environment that now exists over, COVID and climate change and other things, it just won't work. What's going to work, if anything will, is building trust, engaging people face to face, and not avoiding difficult conversations.
This reminds me of Drew Weston's work, The Political Brain, who wrote about this maybe a decade ago, about how Bill Clinton, for instance, was so effective at communicating to voters that wouldn't necessarily, specifically it was all voter related, but at the end of the day, it's all the same mechanism as you're trying to sway people. And he would appeal to their emotions or tap into something very personal to connect with them. But that's also how coalitions are built. And if this is a political crisis as much as it's a messaging crisis, as much as it's a science crisis. So just for folks, watching who, all right, we all believe in science. We all want to move people. We all have family members that may not agree with us. And maybe we fought with them online and maybe that's not the right strategy. It maybe does have to be more in person. But what are some of the tricks of the trade that you could share with folks watching right now?
I guess the main thing to say is that in a human face-to-face encounter, listening counts for a lot. And it's hard. It's hard to listen and not interrupt somebody when they're telling you about some giant conspiracy theory that you think, well, I'm going to deplatform this right now, that just by listening that you're, giving it oxygen. That's not the case. Don't let them think that they've convinced you. But the human tendency is that when somebody is, no matter how rabid they are about a topic, they will eventually stop and say, well, what do you think? Have I convinced you? And then that's your opportunity not to say you're a fool or to argue with them, but maybe to ask questions. Because again, the anecdotal accounts that I've read have to do with people asking a question. The young woman I just told you about was somebody who had asked a question. And so one of my very favorite questions that I will use, and I use this on flat earthers, by the way, so this is against hardcore science deniers, is I'll let them present whatever they want to say. And usually it has to do with evidence, the evidence for climate change, the evidence that the CDC is corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'll ask them this. It seems to me that your beliefs are based on evidence. Is that right? And they'll say yes. And then I'll say, well, if that's true, what evidence could I present to change your mind? What would have to be true to show that you were wrong? They tend not to be able to answer that. Or let me put it this way, it makes them think for a moment. And then if they can't answer that question, don't fill the space. Just let them sit with the ability not to answer that question for a moment. And that's an uncomfortable couple of minutes when they realize, wait a minute, if no matter what the evidence is, I'd still believe this. Maybe it's not based on evidence. Maybe it's faith. Maybe it's ideology. Maybe it's politics. I'm just not going to give up my views. Make them a little uncomfortable.
So you mentioned faith, and that was my next question. There's so much identity, and I understand that you say there's a spectrum, which is really important. Yes. Because, we all have family members, of course, I'm sure, and friends through our lives that, there doesn't seem like there's much to move them. And it's almost as if their beliefs have become their identities.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So it's one thing to challenge somebody about a couple of ideas and maybe they're more flexible and willing to communicate. But then there are folks who their beliefs are their identities. And that could be religious identity. It could be a Trump supporter now. I mean, whatever Trump says, they'll take because it's their identity. It's their community. It's how they feel they belong in a time of crisis. They may have joined because they were seeking at one point, but now it is their lives. So are those people that you can sway at this point? Or are those the ones we say, okay, we can't reach them, but we can reach these other folks?
If you can tell in advance, I take my hat off to you because you don't always know. Sometimes people are the hardest core until that moment when they say, well, I guess I was wrong. And that happens, right? So, there's a famous case of a U.S. member of Congress, Jim Bridenstine, who was such a hardcore climate denier that he gave a speech in Congress about, with all these false claims that, climate deniers make. And so, of course, Trump appointed him to be the head of NASA, because what else would you do with a climate denier? Within a month, Bridenstine changed his mind publicly and said he had been wrong. Now, why? I think it's because he said he read a lot. Well, he had read a lot before, but all of a sudden he was supervising all of these NASA scientists who were not the evil other anymore. He knew them on a first name basis. He was their boss. He hung out with them in the halls. He had lunch with them and began to realize that these are pretty trustworthy, dedicated people and could change his mind. So you are absolutely right that when you attack a science denier's beliefs, you are attacking their identity. It's not just what they believe, it's who they are. If you attack a scientist's beliefs, they may be irritated with you, but if you've got the evidence and they're scientists, they're supposed to change their mind. But with a denier, it really, as I said, it's not about evidence in the first place. As you said, it's about identity. So, but is it possible to change someone's identity? Yes. But that tells you the scope of the problem. It's hard, right? In order to change someone's identity, in order to have them give up one of those core beliefs about Trump or vaccines or climate or whatever it is, you have to take the long game. You can't just, tell them they're stupid, give them a few facts and move on. That's just not going to be a productive conversation.
I've personally found when influencing, when trying to bring people into the circle of communicating about science and facts, it helps to sometimes dismantle the provider of the information.
Yes,
they're giving. So, for instance, if they're getting their information from, an easy one, Fox News and Tucker Carlson, immediately, if it's about science, say, oh, it's interesting that, oil companies are the ones backing the show, or also with Tucker Carlson, if he's talking about income inequality, be like, this is somebody who grew up in wealth. As he's making, $60 million a year, are you going to take advantage in these? So sometimes I feel like that helps, but is that really a good tool? Or is that just something that makes me feel better?
If you can challenge the credibility of a denier's source, that is always to the good. The problem is that one of the tropes of science denial is that they rely on fake experts and denigrate real experts. So you're attacking their sources, they'll attack your sources. I had an email exchange with a guy the other day where he made some outrageous claim about COVID. And I said, please provide me your source. And he did. And it came just from where you'd expect. And I said, well, now, turnabout's fair play. I'm going to provide you some sources. And he said, yes, but they can't be academic, scientific, or governmental. I don't trust those. What can you do in a situation like that? So if it's possible for you to undermine somebody's source, that's good. By the way, when you're entering one of these conversations, it's important for you to have reliable information. And the Yale Climate Coalition has got a terrific website where you can go. They've also got a working paper I remember reading about this whole problem of the spectrum. They divided the science deniers up into 7 or 8 different categories. Some of which you could persuade and some of which you couldn't. And they sometimes give scripts for what you can do. So that's very good. And there are a couple of other websites that, the work of John Cook, who's a cognitive scientist. He's really done a lot of work on climate change and, how to talk to people about it.
Now I think the question is, how do we talk to folks? Because it is much more than, climate change is a policy issue right now. I mean, we need to actually have real politics that shift the way that we handle, and prepare for climate change. But the vaccination's also a policy issue. But there are folks who, no matter how much you try, they're not going to get vaccinated. And it is going to continue to spread, maybe at different rates, maybe in a different, but we're seeing how the variants are affecting with solely the unvaccinated folks who are really, exacerbating this. So this is the crisis of the moment. And but we're not gonna be able to convince everybody, surely. So how do we, what's the best tool with the spectrum at this point?
It's shocking, isn't it? And the parallels between climate change and COVID are really overwhelming. I mean, I remember, I study this. And at the time when COVID denial started, I thought, well, now finally, people are going to understand that when it's a global crisis and it can affect our lives, they need to take it seriously. And then I watched in real time as that disintegrated. People won't even take a vaccine to save their own life, let alone, change their oil consumption habits to save the Maldives or, their own country in the future, or even now as Greece is on fire. And I'm speaking to you from Portland, Oregon, where we had the largest fire ever in the history of the state, the bootleg fire. So there are things. Sorry, I lost track there for a second. Rephrase the question.
Just in terms of the spectrum, I mean, it's one thing, you don't have to hit every climate denier to be able to change policy on climate, just enough to be able to influence it.
Yes,
but in the case of a vaccine and a pandemic, you really, most people need to actually do their part. Otherwise, we're just going to be in this forever.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's frustrating because, as I said before, there aren't any magic words that you can say to a vaccine denier, to a COVID denier. And I think you have to use the same methodology that I've been talking about. As people are polarized, I mean, you're seeing terrible stories these days about, there was something in California the other day about a fight, a fist fight in public over COVID vaccines. That's not going to convince anybody. And I mean, tempers are getting hot on both sides. There was a very interesting, here's something I can offer that's optimistic. There was a focus group done by a GOP, a Republican pollster named Frank Luntz, where he had a focus group of people who, I'm not going to say they were vaccine deniers, but they were skeptical. They didn't want to get they hadn't been vaccinated yet. They didn't want to get the COVID vaccine. And he was trying out different messages to see what might work for them. And what I think he stumbled upon was that by listening to what they had to say about their reasons, they ultimately became much more malleable. So he was looking at, the different groups that he had in, politicians, scientists, different people, to speak to them through video message, and which one worked and which didn't, trying to measure that. I think the effect was that he was taking them seriously and listening to them. Now, the one message that did break through, that they said broke through, was from a scientist who took his time and said, look, science doesn't know everything. Here's what we do know. And here's why we changed our mind on this. And, here what the statistics are. And, he approached them in a very human way, not in an authoritative, I'm a scientist, so you better listen to me, but just sharing information. By the end of that focus group, 19 out of 20 of the people had changed their mind and had said that they were more likely to take their COVID vaccines. There is a way to do this, okay? But it requires the right method and the right message and a patient person to do it. And, it's easy to get despondent about it. It's easy to get angry. I get angry, but to show it, and when you're trying to convince someone, it just turns them off.
Oof. Amazing advice. And of course, being in the media, we're taught to fight. So,
well, I'm a philosopher. We've been known to get into some battles as well.
I've heard in the place of philosophy right now. With that being said, I applaud, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. I applaud Frank Luntz because just by asking people to be part of a focus group, I mean, that alone it became a vehicle to open folks up and make them more amenable, which whether that was his intention or not, it ended up working out. So like, what's that old line? Meet people where they are and then take it from there.
If you ask somebody for their opinion, you flatter them.
Yes.
And then they're more likely to want to know what your opinion is. It's a when I was at that Flat Earth convention, I was quiet the first day, but then when I started to speak and they knew who I was and, were suspicious as hell, I still would when I entered a conversation, would let them speak first. I mean, what else was I going to do? There were 650 of them. There was one of me, but it always happened in that conversation that after I let them spout off everything that they thought was convincing evidence, and then I still shut up. I didn't just jump in with 10 reasons they were wrong. I just kept quiet. They'd say, "Don't you think I'm right? Doesn't that make sense?" And then I'd say, "Well, I have a few questions." And I didn't convince anybody on the spot, but I did get them to listen to me. And I got them to be curious about what I thought, which if I'd come in there just, bowling them over, never would have happened because these were strangers and I was in a hostile environment. Right. And it was a searing experience, but I did it because I wanted to learn how to talk to the hardest core deniers so that I could then go talk to climate deniers.
Exactly. It's so interesting about this. Just as we wrap, I've watched some of these interviews with, and actually on our show, we've interviewed hostage negotiators.
Yes.
Folks who go into, whether it's Syria, as one of our guests had to find hostages or dealing with radical, cult leaders who've held hostages, or, the more traditional hostage negotiation. Like you said, it's you let them talk, you ask questions, and then you build that trust. And then little by little, you may be able to move them over to your side. And I'm sure lawyers experience that too when they're negotiating. Everybody, it's negotiation, essentially.
Lawyers are sometimes a little more hostile, but the hostage negotiator is good. Some literature that I've read on deprogramming people from cults. Ooh. Quite interesting, the tactics that they use. Not bad tactics to use for this purpose as well, because if you think about it, science deniers have been indoctrinated. Right. They didn't come up on their own with the idea that there were microchips in the vaccine. They read that somewhere. And you know what? That lie was created by someone for a purpose.
That's right.
The disinformation is intentionally created because it serves somebody else's purpose, and then it gets out there and gets amplified. And science deniers are victims in many cases because they believe this stuff. And if you remember that, it can help you have some empathy in these conversations with them.
What a great way to have it, to end us. Having a perspective that you come at it as if they're victims. And it's predatory. I mean, it's ultimately that's it. This is somebody who you talk about the man behind the curtain. So many folks think that yes, and they're preying on you to your own demise.
To a conspiracy-minded person, that might just do it.
Yeah. There you go. It's like flip the script. I hate to tell you.
Yeah. Now, I mean, there is some evidence that I have to say it's not a conspiracy theory. There is some evidence that this disinformation is being created by nameable individuals.
Right.
And there aren't that many of them out there to do it. They just get it amplified all over Twitter and social media, and that's it.
Couldn't agree more. We'd love to have you back on. I don't feel like this is going to go away anytime soon. So maybe we can talk about some of those, the agendas of some of the folks spreading this misinformation and how it's facilitated, because that's a whole other topic that I'm fascinated by. But we need like an hour for that. So
thank you. I would enjoy that. Thanks very much for having me on your program.
Of course. Thank you so much. Take care.
All right, guys, if this is the time, if you haven't already, make sure to join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. Our patrons are what keep this show alive and well. It's how we can do it on the road when I'm filming other stuff. It's how I can, honestly, seriously, it's how I can take all this gear with me on the flight because it's expensive to check those bags. Our patrons make sure everything happens. Make sure we have David working his butt off. That is how our community grows, because we can't rely on the algorithms. We know that the algorithms in little places like YouTube and Twitch and all the different spots that we release our show to, you just never can predict. 1 month you're doing kick ass, the other month you're down a certain percentage. It is patrons who keep us going. We have Kayendi Andrews, who is the author of The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. He's also a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and the chair of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity. Thank you, Kayendi, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
So, colonialism is still a thing. Imperialism, colonialism. Before we get into just sort of the crux of what these all represent in the 21st century, can we just do some basic, I guess, definitions? I think we use these terms a lot in modern day, and we see them in memes. But basic definitions, like how would you define colonialism in 2021?
Well, I mean, colonialism is basically when one country or place controls another place, uses resources, drains out its resources, exploits it. Historically, that had been these European empires, like the British Empire or the Spanish Empire, who'd gone around conquering other parts of the world. Today, it looks a little bit different, where you have like formal freedom in places of large parts of Africa, of Asia, etc. But that same relationship where the economics and the people are still exploited in order to make us rich, effectively. Us, when I say us, I mean us in Britain, us in the West. That's still there. And that's why I say colonialism is still very much here today.
Is colonialism today built off of the colonialism of the past, or is this just a completely new form? I mean, people talk about technology and how technology is shaping a new economy, and there's colonialism technology, and it's also based off of previous colonialism, sort of, a Frankenstein version of it, I guess. But would you consider it sort of the foundations were, in being a New Yorker myself, the foundation of New York City and Wall Street, the slave trade into Wall Street? Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to think about it is if you look at a map of global inequality, Africa, Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest part of the world. The places where white people live, right? The West is the richest, and then you have this hierarchy in between. So we literally created the political economy in the image of white supremacy. I mean, that's not an accident. That didn't just happen that happened by design, because of the history of slavery, because of the history of empire. And it was the money that was generated through slavery, through formal colonialism, through that exploitation, which allowed us to have the Industrial Revolution, which allowed us to have all this scientific explosion, etc. Which is why today, when you see that same exploitation happening, and now it's predominantly in Africa, it's about resources, stripping out the resources for far less than their worth. In Asia, it's largely about sweatshop labor. There's a reason why all the jobs went to China, etc., because you can pay them wages we would never accept here. That can't be separated from everything that went beforehand. So it's just one system. It just looks a little bit different today.
So history, like you talk about this in your book, that history has sort of in history books today in the UK and parts of the United States that still fund education. There's still representation that this is sort of the past, and we've moved past this colonial history, especially in the UK, right? But was that just, legally, yes, India became independent. Legally, many different parts of the planet became independent post-colonial. But in those countries, and obviously other countries, did they really, let's stick with the countries that are post-colonial, right? Were there still trade deals that were set up? Was there still, when the UK, when Britain pulled away from India, were there not contracts set up to say, okay, well, we don't own you, but guess what? We still mine here. Our companies are still mining. Is that sort of what you're talking about here?
Yeah. So when Britain leaves India, for example, or leaves Africa, and just leave, in India kind of did just leave really quickly, and that caused massive problems. But the economic relationships are still there, right? The companies are still owned largely by the British, etc. The economic exploitation doesn't go anywhere. So what you have is you have a parliament, you have formal freedom. And India is a really good example because it's often used as this country that's one of the fastest growing economies. It's a success story. 400 million people in India live in conditions we couldn't even imagine. The levels of poverty in India are huge. We celebrate the fact that, so under Britain, famines were a big thing. The British didn't care. So there were famines happened all the time. Post-colonially, there's been no famine. Hasn't been one single famine in India. And you can celebrate that and say, look, there's no famine. But millions of people die in India of poverty all the time. So there's no famine, but the country's so poor because it's still economically exploited by not just Britain, but the West, that you still have the same thing anyway. So it might look different, but it's still exactly the same problem.
Why do you think that history books sort of ignore this?
Because who wants to admit that everything we currently have is based on genocide, slavery, colonialism, death of black and brown people? It's just not something you can really, you kind of have to look away, because if you look at it, then you have to change it, right? So, for instance, think about the panic the world went into over the coronavirus pandemic, which it should have done, right? We had to close down things. We had to, we're still in lockdown, still can't travel to the States, etc. But more people, far more people, 9 million people every year die from poverty. 9 million people die from hunger every single year. Almost all of those are black and brown and in the underdeveloped world. We just don't care. We literally don't care, right? And that's the scale of it. It hasn't. So when we're talking about progress and celebration, actually look at the world. There's nothing to celebrate. It's just as bad. It just, in some ways, it's worse. And this is what Malcolm X. I love Malcolm X. And Malcolm talks about the shift from the European empires to the America becomes the center of empire after the Second World War. And he says, well, what happened was the European empires, they were too brutal. They couldn't work. Like, people won't accept, and people were fighting back. So America comes in with this, he called it benevolent imperialism, where everybody's smiling and look like they were friends, but it's just as bad. And in fact, it's worse, because now we're not fighting back against it. We just kind of accepted that there's nothing else that can be done.
There's a complacency, which I want to get to, how it ties into the world economy and institutions today that, seem to sort of keep the economy together. But we'll get to that in a second. Because yes, I mean, my immediate thought was it was so brutal that there was no way around post-colonialism eventually at some point in society. But with that being said, the new empire in the U.S., we have been brutal. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, the global South, there were genocides. There were in Southeast Asia genocides. Of course, Vietnam. You can't ignore that. I mean, these were in some cases like Vietnam, where there was an actual pushback and at least a national and international conversation about the failures there. But there's also what happened in Jakarta, where most people don't even know about that to this day. If it hadn't been for a book that came out like 2 years ago about how 2 million people were killed, because they once met with somebody who was in a union, and of course the same thing in Guatemala and the global South and Nicaragua, etc. So they were brutal. But is it just because it wasn't happening? I mean, how is it that, especially because media was much more global at that stage in society, how is it that the dots didn't connect?
Yeah, so there's definitely, I definitely don't want to make it sound like I'm saying the violence is gone, because, geez, the violence is there. Afghanistan, there's a perfect example right there, right? So violence is definitely used all the time still. But the reason people don't really care now, that's not new, right? So if you think about the term genocide, even the idea of genocide, only comes into English or any other Western language after the Holocaust, right? It takes bodies we would now see as being white. Everybody was like, that's horrible, that's horrendous. But 10 million people get killed by King Leopold in Congo. We don't care about it. The biggest genocide in human history was in the Americas. Up to 65, 70 million people wiped off the face of the earth. Nobody talks about it. So this has been one of the major facets, if you like, of white supremacy, is that black and brown life just is not worth as much. It is not worth, we don't really care about it, we won't talk about it. So when that violence happens elsewhere now, that's just following a pattern that's been there for hundreds of years.
So what is it that made it so different? When Britain started to decolonize, their whatever, when they started to decolonize, essentially, when there was this independence movement that was happening, what is it that is so different about now, where you still have these, or at least in the last century, where you still have these genocides occurring and they're covered in the press and people just don't seem to care, versus back then where, there was probably much more allegiance to the monarchy and yet they decolonized?
Yeah, but I guess they didn't decolonize because there was some moral. Nobody cared then either, right? Yeah. I mean, decolonization happens because, one, people are fighting back, and two, they just realize this is really in their interest to decolonize. So, for instance, actually, for the UK, one of the things which always underplayed in why Britain was so happy to kind of lose its colony is because of the empire. If you're a Commonwealth, if you're a citizen of the empire, you had right to live in the UK. So after the Second World War, that's why I live in the UK, because my family moved from Jamaica to Britain. And millions of people were moving to Britain. And they couldn't stop them because it's the empire, right? We're all British subjects, not citizens. So you can't stop us moving in. So what the British do basically is they say, well, we'll have independence. We'll make you independent, and then you can't come anymore. And then we're going to put these really harsh laws in place that says you can no longer come to the country. So the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1962, it starts all of the problems that Britain has with Immigration Act starts there. It is not coincidental that is the same year that Jamaica and Trinidad are made independent, because you make the countries independent, then you stop the people coming. So there was no benevolent reason for independence of decolonization. They didn't really have a choice, and they worked out it was actually in their long-term interest to do, and they maintained economic exploitation anyway. So it all worked out. It all worked out really well in the end for Britain.
The economic exploitation. I mean, obviously, the economy that we live in today it survives off of extracting resources. Still, it's not something new. Look at what's going on in the Amazon right now. We covered that on the show today with Bolsonaro. But with that being said, you have the World Bank, you have the UN, these institutions that are supposed to stand for modern day democracy, post World War II democracy, to prevent us from kind of falling into disarray again. You're saying they are basically the same. It's a form of colonialism, neocolonialism. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice story. That's nice, but I mean, that's not what they're there for. And this is where Malcolm says, like, basically the Europeans got trapped. They couldn't manage empire anymore. And so, like in basketball, when you get trapped, what you pass the ball. And they passed the ball to America, who presented. And America's interested because it's just Europe on steroids, right? It's a place where millions of Europeans went, committed the largest genocide in human history, and then created this mass kind of wealth. I mean, it was always going to happen at some point. If you think about America, that it would become the richest place, it would become the center. And if you think about something like the World Bank and the IMF, IMF was set up by America and Britain. The World Bank was set up by America and Britain. The UN was set up by America and Britain. I mean, it was set up by the two heads of white supremacy at the time. And they set it up in a way that would maintain the social order. That was the whole purpose of these institutions. And the IMF was it actually didn't do what it does now. So the IMF firstly loaned to Western countries to basically to bring them up after the war. So Britain took an IMF loan, France had an IMF loan, and this was a way of America taking control. Basically, so, look, we're going to give our parents, if you like, the former empires, we're going to give you the money, we're going to support you, we're going to build you back up. And after that happened, then the IMF starts to loan to the underdeveloped world. But if you think about, let's take somewhere like Ghana, for example, which gets its independence in 56, I think it is. But it's been underdeveloped. When Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, takes over, there's hardly any hospitals, there's hardly any schools, there's hardly any roads. There's all the same companies that owned everything before Ghana was independent are the same companies that own afterwards. All the money's being taken out. So of course, Ghana falls into economic trouble because how could it possibly manage its economy? And then it has to go cap in hand to the IMF, who give them a loan and say, all your progressive policies that you had before, they've got to go. You've got to open up your economy so that America can come in and so that Britain can come in. And we can privatize everything. And that's exactly what happens. That is across the whole entire underdeveloped world, which is why you have this debt problem, this debt crisis, and they just haven't been allowed to develop. So these institutions come in saying we want to be your friend, but they're actually making it worse. And that's not an accident. That really is by design.
So why do you think that so many of these countries still fall for this? I mean, it could be immediately after, post-colonial when they're in transition, or somewhere like, I'm in Greece right now. Greece is a perfect example. Greece is part of the EU. Greece has very educated population, part of Europe, yet still still stuck taking out these loans, forced to take out these loans. Puerto Rico, another beautiful example of this strategy in an actual colony, a modern day colony. People know now. We know the tool, but like, why is it keep happening?
Because you have a choice. Because like this, we talk about globalization like it's new. Globalization, this system was. I mean, that's what makes the West the West is globalization. Is slavery. What is globalization if not slavery? So there's all these economic things which are put into place. So you don't really have a choice. So like Greece didn't want to. I remember this. There was a whole thing we don't want to. But you got a choice because you ain't got no money. Ghana didn't want to take the loans, but what are you going to do, right? And so because of and they end up being forced into it because they're part of the global economy. That's the big problem. It's all tilted one way, and there's very little way to resist against it.
Okay, so let's throw in a couple of other factors here, which you're not necessarily focused on, but I think are relevant to the conversation that we're in today. You have Russia and China. China is very relevant to this, but the U.S. is like super focused on old Cold War or current Cold. I mean, whether the Cold War ever ended. In some, there's lots to be debated there. But it's about world power and empire, and each of these have empires of their own, built off of different financial models, but all seem to be based in some sort of resource extraction, whether it's, Russia declaring war in Crimea and about natural gas and, the turf wars between the US and Russia over natural gas, or, look to Afghanistan, China and the US, China and everybody in Afghanistan. I mean, this is sort of the modern day economy is over resources in many of these regions. But like, is it? I hate to use this phrase that's overused, but is the toothpaste out of the tube? Like, how do we? If you have two other countries, world powers, and the EU, of course, that base their empires off of extraction and exploitation, how can one of these empires not? How can they decolonize without, surrendering to the other world empire?
It's a good question, right? So I think this is the thing where the big debate, the big issue, in the 60s was communism, right? Got Soviet bloc, China. Have we got something different? Is it going to be different? Are we going to have something different, right? And there's a lot of violence. Lots of violence goes into from America and from Britain to quelling that. And what basically happens is they win, right? Capitalism wins. So Russia is. It's not really different. I mean, Russia relies on oil and selling into the West, etc. I mean, it's not
and oligarchs
and China is also the same, right? Yep. China's economic development has basically happened since they joined the West and gave up and said, "Look, we'll basically follow you exactly the same model. We'll oppress 400 million of our own people to make sure we can build everything." But it really is. They are really, in some ways, Russia, China, US, EU. They're probably the equivalent of Britain, France, Germany, Spain in the old system, where they all basically agree on the principles of it. It's just how do you divide it and carve it up. I mean, the problem we have there is, there's only, like you said, resources are finite, and this leads to war, right? When we saw what happened, one of the things that ended the old empire was the Second World War. They just wanted to compete. And unfortunately, if you go forward 50 years, 60 years, there's a good chance you end up in that same place, right? Because they're all fighting over very limited and also decreasing resources as well.
So, I mean, with this being said, like, okay, how can capitalism be defeated? How can we, as a movement, as leftists, as workers, as anybody who has the ability to organize, wherever you live, if you have the ability to do so, what can you do? You're stuck in a system. I mean, you critique Marx in this, and I think it's very smart because this isn't the Paris Commune, which didn't go so well either. I mean, okay, great. Capitalism falls in the U.S. Now, how do you do in China and Russia? Like, what do you...
it's difficult. I mean, one of the things is, going back to the earlier question about why people still just carry on doing things, is the way that we are schooled into thinking about things, right? So colonialism was never just about hard power, about violence. The more insidious part of it was the soft power. It was the religion, the brainwashing, the education, the schooling, and still today, that is what happens. So these ideas are fringe. If you go to most schools, universities, colleges, you're not learning this. You're learning the kind of standard rote Western imperialism. I always say to any student from the underdeveloped world, the worst thing you can do is come and study international development in the West, because you're literally just learning how to damage your economy. That's the purpose of it. So the first thing we have to do is education is massively important. Actually peeling the scales from our eyes, understanding what the scale of the problem is, understanding that you cannot reform capitalism. Everything that we talked about, those 9 million people dying every year from hunger, that's not an example of the system not working. That's the logic of the system. That's what it's supposed to do. We have to do something completely different. And that takes that kind of revolutionary imagination. I mean, in terms of, look, the book I just wrote, The New Age of Empire, is a prequel, really, to Back to Black, which was about black radical politics. In terms of black radicalism, there is a pretty clear blueprint, which is unification of Africa, the African diaspora, a kind of what we call revolutionary Pan-Africanism, where you essentially take Africa out of the world system because Africa has all the resources it needs, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a long-term project, don't get me wrong. But, if you could do something like that, that would bring capitalism down. Capitalism needs to exploit Africa. So I would say I have a black radical solution. Outside of that, I don't know. I just say, look, it's bad, and we have to understand it's really bad. And bad for all of us, because the truth is, capitalism is going to kill us all. If you actually look at global warming, it is going to kill us all if we don't stop. So hopefully people will wake up and realize, right?
Well, and that's what's so beautiful about so many indigenous communities coming together in the Amazon, for instance, and fighting, or people at pipelines, water protectors on pipelines, or folks blowing up pipelines. I mean, there's just so much at stake, survival. And you can actually, transform the debate. Joe Biden was moved to retract the Keystone XL. More and more of that can happen. And those, it's capitalism. So if it happens in the US, the oil and gas market can also be affected with Russia as well. If everybody in the EU goes off of, as they've said, that it goes off of natural gas, that affects Russia. And so, these little things do make a difference. And I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, and I think I would always say organize is the key thing, and all have to think about it as a long-term thing. And I think sometimes with activism, we think, well, what can I do tomorrow? What can I do next? That's not how it works, right? I'm talking about like revolutionary Pan-Africanism. That's a 50-year plan. That is a long plan. And sometimes what's been done and the way that we think about change, etc., is we kind of miss that, the big picture, the long-term plan, etc. But I always think about Europe. The European Union is a perfect example of somewhere where you have to give white people, I don't know, you call it credit for just having a really good imagination and planning really far ahead. I mean, the EU is dreamed up after the Second World War. I mean, imagine that. They've killed millions of people. Germany's like the complete enemy of everybody. And people sit down and say, oh, in a few years' time, if we organize, we have this European Union. I mean, it's really, if you explain that to the average European person, they'd call you crazy. But guess where we are now with not just peace across Europe, massive economic bloc. Germany, of all people, is the leader of the whole thing. So with a bit of imagination and a bit of planning, believe me, anything is possible. If that's possible, then African unity has to be possible, because the problems aren't that bad. I wouldn't have thought.
What's amazing about it is, of all people, of all folks to be able to be defiant to Germany, it's the UK. It couldn't be Greece. It couldn't, it had to be the UK. Which you know too well. Super, really fascinating conversation. Great book. You can go check out The New Age of Empire from Bold Type Books. That's where you can go check it out. We have it in our information section, so you can check it out there. Just click on the link. Really, just fascinating. Kind of flipping the narrative on this. Kayendi Andrews, really grateful to have you on today. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Professor Richard Wilf is joining us today. He is the founder of Democracy at Work. He is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts. His latest book is The Sickness in the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics for Itself. You can go check that out where you buy good books. You don't do it on Amazon, as we all know. Hey, Richard, thank you for joining us. You've been talking about poverty for a long time. There's this new campaign by who, I don't know, the Bill and Melinda, I guess it's just the Gates Foundation types now. I don't know what you call it, what the new name is, but that circle, the Davos circle, that capitalism has reduced poverty globally. And I know you got a lot of thoughts on that. But the most basic way, how is it that I live in New York, and before the pandemic, inequality was worse than it's ever been? But simultaneously, yes, poverty has been, I guess, statistically down. How can these two things happen at the same time?
Well, I think my response to all of that is a kind of intake of breath of the amazing nerve of people to say such a thing. Is it a fact that the standard of poverty it's not as grim as it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Yeah, absolutely. No one is disputing that. But the notion that we should credit capitalism for that, I find that's mind-blowing. Every single step of improving the problem of poverty was fought against the opposition of capitalists. To this day, it's the capitalists in this country who fight against raising the minimum wage. It's the capitalists who don't want to give supports to the family, who don't want to find ways of making it possible for people to get out of poverty. I mean, wow, this is an example of people who have fought hard against everything that relieved poverty. Having lost that fight, they now want to take credit for having achieved what they tried so hard to prevent. I mean, it takes your breath away, this kind of nerve. I mean, wow. Capitalism was the obstacle against which poverty was overcome. I mean, the whole 19th century, for example, was a century in which the working classes of the world fought to reduce the length of the working day from 16 hours to 14 hours. You know, the May Day holiday celebrated around the world came out of the events in Chicago in 1886 that were demonstrations for the 8-hour day. The business community fought it every step of the way. They were eventually defeated. Now they want us to say, look, isn't it nice that we have an 8-hour day? Hello. It's like child labor. The capitalists used to love to hire 6, 7, 8-year-old children. New York City and Chicago are famous for that. That had to be fought by people, and they were told by the capitalists, well, look, we're doing a favor to these poor families. If they couldn't send their little children out, they'd be even poorer than they are now to work. And the rest of the world went, wait a minute, that may be good for you as a businessman or woman, but that's not good for the families of these children. So finally, we got rid of child labor. Should the capitalists now be allowed to say, see, we got rid of child labor? No, 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 no. That's reversing the game. Having lost your opposition, you now want to take credit for what you could not prevent in the end.
You know, I'm working in Puerto Rico right now on a documentary that has a lot of elements of austerity politics. And right. I've been interviewing a lot of people I probably wouldn't normally be talking with, and hearing their version of the solutions that need to be made in Puerto Rico. And it's fascinating because when you just talk to average Puerto Rican, it depends on, you know, who you're talking to, obviously, but how much of like this new version of capitalism taking credit for less poverty is juxtaposed with austerity politics, when you have capitalists, influencing government, when you have right-wing governments and center-left governments putting austerity on in the island of Puerto Rico, it's very obvious, and then switching to privatization. They just privatized the power authority here, and their whole claim is, well, now it's going to work. And that's how we get, poverty. We eliminate poverty. Is now we have a working power system. Is this has this always been the game, or is it more pronounced now that the solutions are coming through privatization, aka capitalism, and that government was never the solution? In fact, that's why you can't get, it takes you 2 hours to get to work every day on these broken roads, et cetera, et cetera.
No, this comes in waves, and the history is pretty crystal clear. You have a period of time in which, for example, the private sector just fails. The best example in this country is the Great Depression. Once it hit in 1929, and it kept going all through the 1930s, it became the cliche of almost everybody that private capitalism left to itself is a disaster. And the government is brought in as the solution. So we had the New Deal, we had Roosevelt coming in there, regulating, taxing, hiring people, creating Social Security, extraordinary intervention that produced what we called after World War II, the American dream, a working class that could afford a home, that could afford a car. Sure, they had to pay on payments. They had to take a mortgage. They had to take car payments and all the rest, but they could do it. But that was the failure of private capitalism, bringing the government in. It terrified the business community. The business community has always been celebrating competition in their 4th of July speeches while killing the government for daring to compete with them. Rather than letting us, the public, say, let's see how the government produces something. Let's see how the private, and then we will vote with our dollars where we want to go and what we want to. No, must not be. So by the 1970s, you have the reverse wave. You have the government is the problem, not the solution, and the privatization is the solution, not the problem. It's literally upside down. What we're living through now is the early stages of another cycle in which the private is more and more looked at as, whoa, look at what you messed up, and the government is called. You can see it, for example, in all the climate discussion. The private sector messed up the environment. It threatens us literally all around us, and we need the government to come in and do this or to do that, and we're going to see it more and more, and that's part of the return of socialism anyway, as an idea that is associated in people's minds with that time when the private looks to be in trouble. I might mention to you, just as a matter of fact, that the wave is further developed in Europe. There's dozens of examples where electric utilities, where water systems, where public transportation that was privatized in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is now being republicized as the government comes in to bail out the bankrupt, dysfunctional private. But we should see that as back and forth. That has been, if you like, a bit of the genius of capitalism. It keeps us focused on whether it should be public or private, rather than on questioning the system itself. Because in the end, whether it's a government official who sits on the board of directors deciding what happens, or a bunch of private individuals elected by shareholders, the basic structure of everyday life in that enterprise isn't that different. And if you want to solve the problems, you got to deal with that rather than, it's a little bit like saying, if only we had non-white people sitting on the boards of directors, or if only we had women, or if only, I'm talking about the people that have been traditionally excluded from those jobs. Of course, I'm in favor of including them. But if that's all you do, you're much more likely to have those individuals adjust to the system than the system break from its traditions because it has fresh new individuals allowed in to play the game.
How do you envision the global economy shifting post-pandemic?
Oh, there's a number of things that are going on. It really is, if I can dare to put my hat on as a professional economist, the world is changing very fast. And if people feel a little bit overwhelmed, they shouldn't blame themselves. They should understand that they are caught up in the winds of change that are terrifying our leaders in this country, whom I know in many cases personally, I can assure you, they do not know what to do. They do not understand the depths of the problems. The honest ones will admit it, at least of people they know, like me. So I can assure you, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, it's not you. It is the situation that you are in fact facing. So let me give you some examples. We have had 3 major wars in the last 25, 30 years: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And in the minds of the rest of the world, every one of those wars, the United States lost. I know in America, it's hard to get your head around the notion that this could have happened, but no one in the rest of the world is at all ambivalent about what happened here. That's a very important reality. That has to become, you have to come to terms with what that means. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq are among the poorest countries in the world. The United States is one of the richest. We have the military. Nobody in the world comes close. And we lost. In the history of empire, that's an unmistakable signal and symptom. Number 2, for the first time in almost a century, we have a really powerful competitor in the world, and that's the People's Republic of China, a reality to which Americans are now, waking up and taking some cognizance. I'm not an alarmist. I don't think that has to mean war. I don't think it has to mean catastrophe, although if badly handled, it could. But whatever else it is, we have to come to terms with the fact that the world is now different. Let me give you one example. The Chinese decided some years ago to focus in on making solar panels, to make the best, those panels that convert sunlight into electricity, basically. They're the best in the world. They completely dominate the market. They went to work to do that. They produce the best quality at the lowest price. The United States now doesn't know quite what to do because it's completely outflanked. I mean, the number 1 producer in the United States of solar panels is a Chinese company that relocated here. I mean, it is as grotesque as you might want as an example. But to be angry and to denounce them, which is what we're doing, that solves nothing, changes nothing. It means the rest of the world begins to realize, and here's the danger, that if you're a company in Norway or France or Italy, you want to be careful about developing your business in the United States, because you don't know when a Trump or a Biden or who knows who is going to weaponize the United States market, use it against you, hurt you. So you think, oh, this is isolating the United States. Again, like other empires, it means the United States is not going to have the wealth of investment and the wealth of options that it used to have. I could go on. Look at the pandemic. I mean, the whole world is scratching its head. The United States has 4% of the world's people and 20% of the deaths from COVID. I can't think. I live with statistics. It's part of my job. I can't think of a statistic that screams its message louder than that one. We are a very wealthy country. We have a highly developed medical system of which we can be proud. But when it came to the worst public health crisis in at least a century, we failed. We could not put together the doctors, the nurses, the ICUs, the tests, the masks, the ventilators to deal with this problem as effectively as countries much poorer with much less developed medical systems than we have. Something is very amiss in our society. That's why we're so upset with one another. That's why the divisions are as bitter as they are. All of these are signs of an economic system that has peaked and is now going down. I don't mean to scare folks, but we had a good ride, we Americans, over the last 150 years. We went from a small colony of England when we soared up to become the global superpower. It was a heady ride. It meant wages went up. It meant people came here from around the world to participate in this wonderful ride up. But when now we are on the other side of that process, and going down is a very difficult, bumpy, scary process. The only model we really have in our own recent history is the decline of the British Empire, which we should be studying so we don't have the kinds of problems they did. But that's the reality, and I understand it's hard for people to get around. But if you ask me what the post-pandemic U.S. economic forecast, or let's put it this way, landscape is, I'm afraid I have to tell you these things, partly because the mass media shy away from it, which I partly understand, but isn't the smart way to cope.
So looking forward, China being obviously a superpower that is transitioning to their being the lead superpower, I guess. How does that inform? And I know, and they're buying up real estate and ports all over.
Right.
My family lives in Greece, and there's like a lot of conversation about the ports of Greece being bought up by China, which is a very real concern.
Yep, they bought Piraeus, the major port outlet from Athens, some years ago, and they've used it to move across Europe. Very effective. That's right.
Exactly. Very strategic. So, our relationship with the United States' relationship with Europe, the EU, and of course that has an effect on the Mideast as well. But I'm curious how, like, our relationship with the global South, the rise of the left in the global South, hopefully keeps going. And simultaneously, this strange rise of the right in parts of the EU, how that plays out while China is just being super thinking. I don't know how long in advance they're thinking, but pretty far in advance. How do you see this all kind of like playing out geopolitically?
Well, I think that the Chinese are showing the world something actually similar to what the United States did. The United States made a commitment to go in the direction of a private capitalism. It had to switch to a state-run or state-regulated during the Great Depression because how disastrous that was. It frightened everybody, including the capitalists. So they said okay to Franklin Roosevelt to really massively intervene with the government. And he did that. And he did it for them as much as he did it for anybody else. But immediately thereafter, in 1945, when the Second World War is over, when Franklin Roosevelt dies in office as a president, we saw the business community recoil from the government having coming in so massively in the 1930s, to be followed in World War II with the alliance of the United States with the Soviet Union. It was like a nightmare of the arrival of the other in our society. And we had a reaction. It has to be understood. The post-World War II period in America is very, very important. There was a coalition that won the New Deal. It was the CIO, the massive union movement, the greatest unionization drive in American history by far. Millions of people who had never been in a union joined the union. These were people whose parents had never been in a union. They joined the unions in huge numbers. They joined 2 socialist and 1 communist party here in the United States in very large numbers. And they all worked together, the communists, the 2 socialists, and the unions. And they were a very powerful force, which terrified, remember in 1929, you're really only a dozen years after the Russian Revolution. It's in everyone's mind. It's not some ancient historical event. It's real. And people were terrified, the capitalists, the business class. And after the war, they were very smart. They understood that the problem wasn't Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, he was dead anyway by then, but the point, it wasn't him. It was the push from below, the unions, the socialists, the communists. That had to be destroyed for fear that it would forever transform the American system and put the capitalists not at the top of the pyramid, but somewhere in the middle. They didn't want that. So we had a real purge. It started with the communists. instead of them being gung-ho leaders of the unionization movement, they were converted into evil agents of a foreign power, and they were persecuted, and they were imprisoned, and they were deported. And as soon as that was done, we went after the two socialist parties. And we basically explained to Americans that socialists are like communists. They just spell it differently, which, is bizarre. But my students in the United States, and I've been a professor here in the United States all my life, they think communist socialists, it's all the same thing, something no European would ever think. They all understand the difference because it's real, not here. And now, ever since, we've been destroying the labor movement, which has been in a decline for 50 years. So we've destroyed that whole left mentality so that it has to now be slowly recreated, which it's happening. But it's very slow. It's nowhere near as well developed as Europe, which never had that kind of persecution. People who are communists and socialists have been active in the politics of Europe without interruption since the end of World War II. Nothing like what happened in the United States. And for me, I see there all the different signs. There really is a left in Europe, and it's strong. I give as an example to audiences in the United States, a country like Portugal. And I'm playing a little bit with my audience because they're not familiar. Americans don't learn about these things. So I play a little game. Do you know about the government in Portugal? Nobody stirs because Americans don't. I mean, they know what Portugal is, but they don't know what the government is. So I say, well, let me introduce you. It's a coalition government. It's got three political parties. The biggest one is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The second one is the Portuguese Communist Party. And the third one is the Portuguese Green Party. That's the government. You should see my audience. I wish I had a camera. I could just capture the eyes. The very idea of such a thing is foreign in the worst sense of that word. And then I say they were elected in 2016. They've been the government a long time. And last year they were reelected with a bigger majority than they had the first time. The Portuguese want socialists and communists in the government. It's too much for Americans. And therein lies a very powerful reality. Americans had a hard time understanding Syriza in Greece. Where could that come from? How could you have a government like that?
Greeks had a hard time understanding Syriza.
And if you know something about that, the refusal of the Syriza and the Communist Party, which remains an important part of Greek politics, to work together, to keep very separate. This bespeaks, whatever you like or don't about that, it bespeaks a left that's aware of itself, that has a sense of its own roots, that has real following. In Germany, when I explained to people, Angela Merkel is not the person who won the election. She didn't. She lost. She has to have a government of coalition because she can't get enough votes. And her coalition partner are the Socialist Party of Germany. People look at me, and Americans are not stupid. They're just as smart as everybody else. So what's the issue? This is all kept out of consciousness. It's not processed. It's not brought in to understand the world. And I think we're going to pay the price of not understanding why Europe goes in a different direction. Why the Europeans, when they're told by the Americans, you must not make a deal with Russia about the gas that the Russians are sending in by a pipeline going through the northern Scandinavian area. Americans don't understand it, that the Germans, well, I don't want to be impolite, but they basically give the United States the finger. You're not going to tell us where we get our gas. And you can jump up and down. We don't care if you're Trump or Biden. This is not. We are going to work a deal for us navigating between China and you. And right now, Jack, the Chinese and the Russians offer us more to get out of our problems than you do. And the Americans, I don't think, Mr. Biden and his advisors, some of whom I know, they don't know how to cope. And it's not them. They are smart people and they're clever and they have lots of staff. It's more of a mindset. We are now facing a very difficult time of transition, and we're not prepared for it. The very purging after World War II was so successful here that whole way of thinking has been expunged and now has to be rediscovered, which is happening, but it's slow and it's behind the ball. It's not developing as we need it.
I couldn't agree more. Oh my God. I would love to have you back on to talk about this, about the pace, because while it's exciting to see some electoral wins and a rise in union membership in the last few years, like you said, it's not enough and it's not happening fast enough.
That's right.
And the terms of power are still set by the neoliberals and the Bidens, who
absolutely
seem frozen.
They
they're great at one thing: killing the left. That's what they're great at.
You're absolutely right. Frozen is actually, if you don't mind, I'll use that.
What?
That's a good image. They're frozen in ways that worked for them. Let's be fair to them. Since 1945 is a long time ago. From 1945 to about now, they've called the shots. They destroyed their ideological, political enemies. They either said to the Democrats, you have to disappear or you have to become more like us. The majority of the Democrats, the centrists, became more like them. And so we have that very comfortable oscillation between the Republicans and the Democrats, all that post-war period. And, in a sense, it worked for them. It was the period of United States hegemony. But that period is now over. They should have understood it's always over sooner or later. It has been for every other dominant power. To imagine that we wouldn't suffer what every other one does is a leap and a stretch that they shouldn't have allowed themselves the luxury of, but they did. And so now they don't know quite what to do. By the way, they've been trying to squelch the Chinese now throughout the Trump administration. It started even before that. It isn't working. And they don't seem to have the capacity to recognize it isn't working. The Chinese are not doing any of the things you said you wanted them to do. They're angry at you. They're making progress technologically to do end runs around you. You're supposed to be able to adjust if it doesn't work.
Right.
But they're so trapped in that way of thinking, frozen, as you nicely put it, that they're just not up to it. And it's kind of sad to watch. I was a classmate. I got my PhD around the same time as Janet Yellen. We were at the same university. We were getting the same degree from the same teachers and sitting in the same room. I know exactly what her formation is. And she's part of that.
Yeah.
She's frozen where they were because she wasn't a radical like a few of us were, and were breaking away at that time. And so I know her personally, but I also know what her formation is, and that of people like her. And frozen in a place that's now out of date, that captures it very well.
Frozen in a crisis. Title of...
Not a good place to be.
No.
Not a good moment to be frozen.
Not a good... Richard Wolff, thank you so much for joining us. You can check out Richard Wolff's latest book. He's also the founder of Democracy at Work. His latest book is called The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. So on topic, so timely. Thank you so much, Richard Wolff.
Thank you. It was a really good conversation, and I'm really appreciative of your arranging for us to have it.
Oh, of course. Anytime. Thank you.
Grafton Tanner is the author of Circle of the Snake, Nostalgia and Utopia in the Age of Big Tech. He is also the author of Babbling Corpse, Vaporwave, and the Commodification of Ghosts. His work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books and The Nation, among many other places. Grafton, this is such a timely book. The first few days of this year have shown quite a bit of chatter on the internet, and folks who have large audiences are making arguments that remind me of a different era, I gotta say. So I'm curious, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it came from two different threads of research that I had been doing at the time. One specifically on nostalgia, but then another that I was doing on big tech and trying to bridge the two together and look at the cultural effects of big tech. And that sort of was where the link with nostalgia came up. I read an article that The Atlantic wrote in 2016, their tech issue about Tristan Harris, and who was one of the guys who made The Social Dilemma. And this was back before this documentary, obviously. And he was being interviewed and saying things like, I created all these technologies, Facebook or, Google in particular, and oops, I happened to destroy the world a little bit and elect a fascist and whatnot. Sorry. And that was honestly the point at which I was thinking, I want to write about this, actually.
So we have this segment booked out far in advance, and I'm really kind of blown away because the last few days of the year, and really it's been going on for about a month or so, there's been increasing conversation about why, on the left specifically, about this force the vote tactic, and the podcasters and the folks who are involved in backing it. And, as somebody who has a YouTube show and very familiar with the analytics of Google, I've talked about this on the show before. The audience that I have, as great as they are, it is overwhelmingly male and under the age of say 45, let's say. And I know that is much larger. I mean, it could get into the 90s, 90% at least for some of these other hosts. And, I made a very honest statement, why is this algorithm of young males determining our political discourse right now on the left when there's so many other voices that should be included? And people say, well, that's an identity argument. But I'm like, no, that's a fundamental algorithm argument. There was somebody at Google who was fired for exposing this. And she was in charge of literally fixing this problem. So it just seems baffling, after the social experiment and after, a lot of revealing research and lawsuits at this point, that the tech companies continue to allow the algorithm to operate this way.
Right. Well, and a lot of that has to do with who is sort of creating the algorithm. A big myth of our time is that the algorithm or algorithms are totally neutral and that they're, and that's why we can trust them to solve problems for us, is they're unbiased. And that's just patently untrue. And there's plenty of research out there that reveals this. I can't recommend this book enough. Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. Excellent book, talks about race, how it's pretty much encoded into the technologies we use every day. And most of these guys are guys, white, technocratic, tech bros, if we can use that term. And, no. and they only really know this very narrow worldview. And it's sort of a STEM-based tech, computer science worldview. And so, of course, that kind of prejudice is going to show up in the code.
So I'm curious, when you say nostalgia, how far back are we thinking? And is it conscious nostalgia, or is it sort of just because there are just bros?
Well, I sort of boil down three connection points between nostalgia and digital technology. And I should say, nostalgia as an emotion is really only a few hundred years old. 1688, in fact, is when the word shows up. So we can't even really say whether people in ancient Rome were nostalgic. Some people say maybe that's the case, or maybe it's just a condition of modernity. I kind of think it's the second one. In terms of digital technology, the internet's a giant archive. I could be scrolling through Twitter or Instagram and not even be wanting to feel nostalgic, and suddenly somebody's posted something about my 90s Nickelodeon childhood or something, and there it is, right? Same thing with anger. You're scrolling through Twitter, you see something that makes you angry. I guess I wasn't planning on being angry today, and there it is. So the internet, giant archive, people post things from all of our history, cultural history, especially for anybody to see at any given time. There's also the fact that digital technology kind of creates this sort of logic of entrepreneurialism. You must always be on, always marketing. Look, that's just the breeding ground for nostalgia, which is a reaction to that kind of, in the crucible, anxious sort of mentality. And then finally, there's just the fact that most of the culture we consume through Spotify, Netflix, any of these kinds of streaming platforms helps to facilitate a kind of nostalgia, because these companies gather tons of data on us as users and then pretty much project that data forward and say, if you like this, you're going to like this. And the second thing is pretty much just like the first. And so those are the three main kind of connection points, if you will.
So where does it go from being nostalgic of like the slime being dropped on the head on Nickelodeon to other forms of nostalgia?
You mean like more reactionary kind of like, yeah. Well,
like political nostalgia, and especially if it's nostalgia among, when you're saying that this is the audience, like for instance, let's use this argument of being a YouTube show where it's all like white men, like I'm going to guess like majority of white men are going to have different nostalgia than say I have, or someone who grew up in a different community or a different country.
Absolutely. Well, so if we want to use two terms that get thrown around with nostalgia, because nostalgia is, if it's an emotion, we can agree that it's an emotion. It could be used in unproductive or productive ways, just again, like anger. And so Svetlana Boym was this nostalgia scholar, early 2000s. She wrote, there's reflective nostalgia, which can be kind of productive, kind of melancholic. You're wistful, you're yearning about the old days, but that's kind of it. And then there's restorative nostalgia, where you go, no, that's not it. I'm going to take the next step, an action step. We got to get back to the origin point. We got to make things good again, because things are so bad in the present. Okay. So I think that over the past 20 years or so, this second restorative strain has kind of won out, because it's more easily commodified. You could, a company could sell you the thing to get you back there, so to speak. And then politicians can appropriate it too. They could say, hey, let's mobilize a lot of people. If you believe in me, we'll get back there to that point. We'll go and remake things great again. And this was Donald Trump's tactic pretty much.
It's fascinating. And how much of this is there's an emotion of nostalgia. And then you mentioned there's like anger also. Why doesn't happiness play as much of a role, at least on the political side? If you're going to say, Donald Trump and he throw back to a time, make America great again. Why doesn't happiness have that same kind of reaction on folks or effect?
Well, specifically about nostalgia, the nostalgic person looks around and says something is not right. Something's been lost. And I feel it. And, then the next step is where things go wrong. Like, what did get lost, and, people then suddenly start to yearn for like the era of Jim Crow or something heinous like this, right? Or not. They yearn for a different period. It could just be like their childhood or something. But so this sort of dissatisfaction with the present, there's a quicker link from that to a kind of anger that can be more easily mobilized. Is that kind of like what you're...
Yeah, it's just interesting because, there's so much conversation about like technology, Twitter, social media being anger machines. I mean, they're just like if one person is nostalgic and angry about, missing the Jim Crow era, and then you have people of color being angry at that, it like feeds off of each other. And then, and doesn't that kind of affect the algorithm as well?
Well, it's generated by the algorithm essentially, because look, the social media business model for the past decade, the one that made people like Zuckerberg extremely wealthy, is to try to get sustained attention, get your eyeballs on the screen at any all the time, every day, for hours on end. And one way that they do that, or one way you can easily do that, is by trying to get people really angry and outraged. And then they're looking and they're scrolling. It's really effective. But nostalgia is also just as effective. They both sort of hold your attention where you really want more. And the more attention that's paid to Twitter, Instagram, social media, what have you, the more money that's generated thanks to advertising revenue. This is a business model. It doesn't have to be the business model, but it is.
How conscious are all the tech companies? I mean, we have a sense of Facebook and their work with Cambridge Analytica, but how conscious is like Twitter
or Amazon, or I don't know how far this goes.
They're all pretty much using the same business model. And so, they can signal their consciousness all they want, but they are, kind of the logical result of this sort of, unfettered, deregulated tech capitalism. So, and this is one of the issues I have with the social dilemma is a lot of these ex-technocratic guys were coming out saying, we can just if only we could just press a button and then the whole thing disappears. And this actually happens at the end of the documentary in like a hypothetical scenario. It's just impossible because big tech is capitalism at this point. It capitalism relies on it, so their consciousness can only go so far. It really has to be, there has to be some regulation in place for them to change, I think.
And so there's a lot of talk about this, right? And coming out of the Trump administration, but it's not going away. And there are, we'll get to some of the other tools that are out there that are kind of exacerbating it. But what regulation is possible at this point? Like, what can you do? I mean, you're not going to shut it down. Is it state takes over Facebook or?
I mean, I'm in support of like a publicly owned, a public option for social media. I mean, so that would obviously require breaking it up completely.
Force the vote. No, sorry.
Well, yeah,
I had to go there.
But that's going to be pretty impossible because, the idea that like the private sector just flourished and then the state withered in its shadow or something. Look, they work in tandem. I mean, that's just kind of sort of how neoliberalism works, is that the state pretty much gives the permission through deregulatory laws for something like big tech to even get as big as the companies are. I mean, Amazon can't get this big without the permission to do so, and so, until the day comes that there's some monopoly busting legislation on the table, you're going to keep running the show.
But even if there's monopoly busting legislation, it's so big now. It's how do you break apart Facebook? How do you break apart Amazon, which is just literal, and Google, of course. Hi, Google, which is just taken over literally every aspect of our lives. I mean, Amazon, people's server, they're using their servers. It's hard to even say, listen, I want to be out of this. I will no longer use Facebook. That's fine. Like the only reason I use Facebook is because it's a directory for me now. It's literally it. It's like, and our show goes up there. But personally, I use it because I don't know how to reach my friends and family anymore. Yeah,
you got to get off. Listen, and let me tell you, I'm like the last person to tell someone to take like a digital detox because, I mean, I have friends of mine who are they run their own companies or whatever. They have to use Facebook, and they hate it, but it's the only way they're able to get word out or whatnot. I can attest that not being on it, or while I was on it, I felt pretty miserable. But look, you're absolutely right. These things are entrenched, and they're international. So if we're not going to try to, or there's no way to regulate big tech and try to break it up tomorrow, then the only way that I know how to support, a resistance against them would be supporting someone like the Alphabet Union that was announced yesterday, and trying to, fight for some better standards. But then again, and this is a problem again I'll keep going back to the social dilemma guys, but this is a problem with their critique also, is that they pretty much just ignore the violent supply chains that prop up big tech. If you want to have a sustained movement against them, it has to be international. It has to include the people in China at Foxconn who manufacture the products and so forth. And they're not mentioning them.
That's fascinating. So in terms of this supply chain, like what would it be? Boycotting Foxconn, boycotting some of these companies in the supply chain that are overseas, or even if they are overseas and they're exploiting workers or literally extracting resources from communities that have no choice. How do you have a deeper conversation about that? Even with a small unionization. I mean, this was fantastic what happened with the Alphabet Union, but and it's a great signal as to where hopefully we're going. But even in a union, like how do you submit those demands?
Well, so to step back a little bit, one of the first things that has to happen is that we have to dispel this notion that, the the technology is like magic, and it just kind of comes out of the sky from the tech wizards on the stage who give it to us, this great gift of technology or whatever, and that it just appears. We go to the Apple store and we can't see sort of what was behind the creation of the phone or the laptop or whatever, all the stuff that we use all the time. Nor can we see like the cables that run underneath the ocean that assures that we're able to like get on Zoom right now or something. And so being able to like try to get that in the public's ear a little bit, which again, I think is one of the reasons why I have such a problem with the Social Dilemma, is that it's, enormous platform, the documentaries on Netflix, and yet none of that is talked about. In fact, they even talk about technology as a kind of magic. It's just really problematic. So being able to get that into the public conversation, don't forget about where these things come from, not only, and also the environmental impact of tech. That's a crucial first step. That I would like to see that before anything else.
I just read the book, How to Hide an Empire, which talks about the American Empire and how we've been, since our origins, we've been extracting. We have colonies. We've had colonies and still do sort of all over the world. But there was this one, it was really interesting is, 80 years ago, we had a very public conversation in our country about this literally bird poop. We had a colony because there was this type of bird poop that was so valuable, and rubber is another example. And it wasn't until we were able to pull off of those and manufacture them on our own with plastic, not a great alternative, that we were able to extract and not colonize certain, I'm giving a very basic overview, parts of the world. But there was a very public conversation about it. That's what I'm trying to say. It was on the cover of all the papers. The public was very involved. You had lawmakers engaging in it. And it's just so interesting how there's such a disconnect now. And I think that's a really important point you make, because we have shifted so much in society that we don't even recognize like how much of our lives are continue to be built off of not just hurting the environment, but ripping apart communities and exploiting people all over the world. I mean, that's what the trade deals are about. But through the tech lens, that's a very important point.
Yeah, and I think that the reason that we had pretty much a decade, like the late 2000s up until about the election of Donald Trump / Cambridge Analytica, you had about a decade of people like Steve Jobs on stage and people giving TED Talks, and that whole genre of extemporaneous kind of speaking about technology in a way where it's just like really magical and it's for you. And I mean, like the iPhone is an amazing invention, but the way that it was talked about, you have to go back and do a lot of rhetorical surgery, if you will, to try to get people to think differently about it.
So where do you see the future going? How do we not just regulate and break apart these tech companies, but where do you see, if that doesn't happen, how bad could it get? I mean, I feel like this is a telling moment, not just with the 2016 election, but how you now have like foreign governments that have invested in like troll farms to kind of recognizing how broken the system is, at least here. The EU is pushing back in some ways, but where does the future of our American, let's say, political discourse go when you have platforms that are just, they lack accountability or interest in actually doing anything about this?
Well, I think you're going to probably see more of this rightward drift that you're experiencing, you're kind of seeing across the world right now with, people like Orban and Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil and people like this, where there is such outrage generated at like the individual level by using something like Twitter or whatever that scales so quickly to a group of people who want to alleviate it by any means necessary, that they will put their faith in people who will promise to do that, but I also think that because we're entering into the 2020s with some of these ex-technocrats being the loudest, maybe not the loudest, but the most distributed voices of tech criticism, we're going to have to deal with them for a while, because they will be the ones who say, sorry, I created Facebook and destroyed the world. At least I'm not Mark Zuckerberg, but I did help create it. Now listen to me. I'm going to tell you how we're going to fix it. And we're going to do it by, I'm going to make you buy new apps and new phones and this and that. And, and that there's no guarantee that that's going to create any different attention economy than the one that we're already in. And so without, trying to look to other voices, like the people who have been studying this far longer than Tristan Harris and the Social Dilemma guys have been, is going to be pretty crucial.
They're going to basically monetize whatever the solution is.
Yeah, they'll say that,
without doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not Mark Zuckerberg, so you can trust me, and then kind of become Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe.
How dystopian. All right. Final question is, how dystopian is this?
Yeah, I have hope though. Like seriously, it's dark. I mean, everyone can kind of agree that the future is sort of hard to envision at this point, and that's another reason why nostalgia tends to be so potent. But I think that in addition to having this sort of continuing rightward drift or whatever, being able to have a sustained progressive movement against tech, not just against it's got to be pointed against big tech, I think is going to be important. And you'll probably start to see it over time.
You've seen like a lot of harassment of lawmakers, like the Squad, women of color in the last, always, I shouldn't say that, Fox News, the right wing, QAnon, all these places have done this for a while. But you're seeing it in the last few weeks with like a version of the left, I'll say. And my hope is that they take it amongst themselves because they're being personally affected by this. Their safety is being affected, that they actually call for regulation, and that those in Congress who are feeling the effects in their face, right, push back. And, perhaps we'll get there. I don't know. Yeah, that's the hope. Grafton Tanner, so interesting. Go check out his book. Thanks for your patience today with our tech issues. Speaking of, you can check out his book, The Circle of the Snake, Nostalgia and Utopia in the Age of Big Tech. This is a very important book to read in 2021. So we appreciate your work. And thank you.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, faith fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.